You were never meant to hear this. In the fog-drenched village of Barrow-in-Furness, 1831, buried deep beneath the blackened stones of a long-demolished orphanage, they found 63 identical graves. No names, no coffins. Just child-sized holes in the soil and a silence so complete, it felt like the land itself was complicit. Every child who entered that place vanished before their 13th birthday. Official records show nothing unusual. But the villagers remember. They remember the screams that echoed out of locked windows at midnight. They remember the strange men who arrived with empty carts and left with full ones. And they remember the sermons long, guttural sermons delivered by a priest whose eyes never blinked and whose voice carried inhuman tones. You've been taught to look away from stories like this, to call them folklore, mass hysteria. But you didn't come here for comfort, you came for truth. And I'm telling you now, what happened in that orphanage was no accident. It was a blueprint, a hidden ritual encoded into the structure of power, hidden in plain sight, still at work today refined. Scaled, sanitized. Because when a child disappears in a world built on control, it's never random, it's calculated, it's necessary. And the ones who pull the strings have always known the cost. This isn't about ghosts. This is about empire, institution. The long game of shaping minds and breaking souls. This story will not make you feel safe. It will make you feel awake. But once you hear it, truly hear it, you can never return to sleep. They counted on that. That's why they buried it. But you found it, and now we begin. They called it St. Hesper's Home for Lost Children. A name that sounded merciful, redemptive, but the locals whispered another name, the Hollow House. No one could say exactly where the term began, but everyone knew what it meant. It was the place where children were taken when they had no name, no family, and no future, and they never came out whole. From the outside, it was respectable. Tall iron gates, a brick façade aged by rain and soot, a towering steeple that seemed to stab at the sky. Inside, it was different. Cold, silent, the kind of silence that doesn't arise from discipline, but from fear too deep to be expressed in words. The children never laughed, never played. Their eyes were hollow, their movements mechanical, their skin unusually pale. The staff said it was illness, weak constitution. But records show the children entered healthy. It was only after the so-called blessing sessions that things changed. These sessions were never described in detail, even in the orphanages. Own ledgers, just a time and a room number. Room 6, always room 6. The same room where the village constable claimed to hear low droning sounds one night when he passed by. The kind of sound that doesn't come from human mouths. He never filed a report. He died 2 weeks later of sudden apoplexy. The doctor who signed the death certificate had only lived in the village for 4 days. Never seen again. They used scripture as a mask, ritual as a weapon, and isolation. As the crucible, 12 was the age limit. After that, nothing remained. The official line was always the same: transferred to family, adopted, rehomed abroad. But no records of those families exist, no travel manifests. Number. Parish confirmations. It's as if the children simply dissolved. And in a way, they did. This wasn't just an orphanage. It was a machine, a system, a test bed. Because if you want to understand how to control the masses, you start with the ones no one will miss. You learn to extract identity, to rewrite the mind, to sever spirit from self. And if the body fails, no matter, there are always more orphans, always more raw material for the machine. The foundation stones of St. Hesper's were older then. The orphanage itself older than the village. Beneath the main hall, deep in the earth, archaeologists later uncovered remnants of a pre-Christian temple, circular in design, lined with scorched altars and symbols that bore no resemblance to any known language. Charred bones, twisted iron, And at the very center, a depression in the stone floor, exactly the size of a child's body. These findings were buried within weeks. Official documentation sealed, the lead archaeologist dead by accidental hanging. But those who'd seen the site said it reeked of something ancient, older than Rome, older than Babylon. The kind of ancient that doesn't just fade. It waits. Why would a Victorian orphanage be built atop such a place? Unless that was the point. In every age, the powerful have known the truth. Location matters. Power echoes through time, bound to specific ground. Build your house on cursed soil, and it becomes more than brick and mortar. It becomes a conduit, a mirror, a gate. The priests at St. Hesper's weren't normal clergy. They didn't speak Latin. They didn't pray publicly. They kept to themselves, speaking in low tones, sometimes with strange hand gestures that villagers began to call the veiled signs. The local rector was replaced shortly after voicing concern to the archdiocese. His replacement had no prior record in any seminary. In fact, to this day, there is no paper trail for the men who ran St. Hesper's. Not one. No birth certificates. No ordinations. Just faces in old, yellowed photographs, faces that, according to some, never aged. What were they doing in that place? And more importantly, who were they working for? You see, the structure of modern control didn't begin with kings or bankers. It began with the priesthood. Because before a man can be ruled, he must be broken from within. And what better subjects than children? Isolate them. Strip them, remove their memory, feed them symbols. Tell them suffering is holy, obedience is sacred, and silence is salvation. You don't need chains when the mind is caged. The rites that took place beneath that building weren't experiments. They were rehearsals for the institutions we now take for granted. The school, the asylum, the prison. All patterned after what happened here. And still, no one speaks of it. Until now. In 1831, something cracked. The system they built beneath. St. Hesper's began to falter, not because of exposure, but because of something no one expected, resistance from within. It began with a boy named Elias, age 11. A quiet, gaunt child with sunken eyes and a scar down his left cheek. No known family, no baptismal records, and no speech for the first 6 months he was there. Then one day, without warning, he screamed. Not a word. A scream so long, so high-pitched it shattered 3 stained glass panels in the chapel. Witnesses say the sound made the other children freeze, as if some forgotten instinct had awakened. The priests found Elias in room 6. The door had been bolted from the inside. No one could explain how he entered. When they finally forced their way in, they found the boy staring at the far wall, tracing symbols into the wood symbols identical to the ones carved into the stones beneath the building. What happened next was covered up. But a page survives, torn from a lost diary, recovered in the rubble after the orphanage was burned to the ground 10 years later. It describes the days after Elias's scream. Children refusing food, huddling together in silence, drawing the same markings in dust, in soap, in blood. One priest disappeared. Another was found drowned in the well, mouth sewn shut. The diary ends mid-sentence. You've been taught that history moves in clean lines, kings, wars, inventions. But the real history is non-linear. It pulses in hidden veins. It surfaces in anomalies. Children like Elias weren't accidents. They were disruptions. The system is built on compliance, but it always fears the outlier, because one awakened mind is a contagion. And awakening spreads. So they erase it. They call it madness, possession, defect, and they bury the bodies so deep no one ever asks questions. But Elias didn't disappear. At least not in the way they planned. There are reports of a boy matching his description appearing in a different village 3 years later, leading other children into the forest. All vanished. Except one, That girl grew up, changed her name, and decades later, tried to expose the truth in a self-published pamphlet. Only 5 copies survive. One is locked in a private collection at the British Library under restricted access. The rest? Destroyed. Because if you knew what Elias awakened in that room, you'd never send your children to school again. In the winter of 1834, a private letter was intercepted by a postal clerk in Manchester. It was addressed to the Archbishop of York, sealed with black wax, and carried no return name, only a strange emblem pressed into the seal, a circle flanked by 3 vertical lines and a small inverted cross. The clerk, curious and unnerved, broke protocol and opened the letter. What he found inside was not a letter. It was a warning. The page described a breach in the veil at St. Hesper's. It spoke of a ritual interrupted, a process undone, and it named Elias, directly calling him the misaligned vessel. The author claimed that the orphanage was not merely a place of containment, but an educational theater, part of a larger program to instill compliance, erase identity, and replace it with a manufactured soul, one that obeys, conforms, consumes, and forgets. But Elias disrupted the sequence. He triggered what the writer called the reversal, a fracture in the emotional programming, a reassertion of original selfhood. The letter was confiscated by agents within 24 hours. The postal clerk was institutionalized for hallucinations and self-harm, though no evidence of such was ever found. His last journal entry reads, "The eyes of the children are windows to a world we were not meant to see. When they remember who they are, the world shatters. Every government, every empire, has its hidden arm, not of enforcement, but of forgetting. Not suppression through violence, but through subtle erosion. Make the people forget who they were. Start young. Remove fathers. Replace mothers. Create sterile, institutional corridors of authority, nuns, nurses, wardens, guards. Then present. Obedience as virtue, grief as weakness, conformity as healing." This was not a mistake. It was engineered. And St. Hesper's was the model. What they learned in those chambers became the bones of future institutions. The boy who wouldn't break was not their failure, he was their greatest threat. Because if even one child could resist, that meant the conditioning wasn't absolute. And if it wasn't absolute, it had to be hidden. They destroyed the building within a decade. Quiet fire. No official investigation. But the rituals continued elsewhere, refined, rebranded. The mind-breaking systems never stopped. They simply went public. Have you ever wondered why modern education feels more like containment than liberation? Why hospitals make you feel powerless? Why churches today seem hollow? Look deeper. You're walking through the ruins of St. Hesper's. Even now, the illusion was never about hiding the truth, it was about replacing it. You weren't meant to forget St. Hesper's. You were meant to never know it existed. That's the real mastery of control, not suppression, but substitution. Give the masses a cleaner version of reality, something easier to digest. Build a new narrative brick by brick, until the original is lost beneath the weight of comfort. The Hollow House became a footnote, then a myth, and finally, a joke. A campfire tale told by children, passed on like a virus, stripped of its teeth. But the rituals that happened inside its walls were not stories. They were procedures, carefully measured, repeated, documented, and passed on to others in power across institutions, across continents. What they learned in 1831 shaped policies in 1931, and now, in 2031, you'll see its full bloom. You already feel it. The crushing conformity, the sterile classrooms, the algorithmic surveillance. Do you think it's coincidence that modern children are being flooded with diagnostics, labels, disorders, prescriptions? Do you believe the pharmaceutical industrial complex arose independently of historical trauma-based conditioning systems? Or do you see it for what it is, an evolved model of psychological partitioning, rooted in experiments like St. Hesper's? Now refined into science, this is why you're here. Not for entertainment, not for stories, but for memory. Because something inside you has not forgotten, that deep pulse, that tightening in your chest, the suspicion you've carried since childhood that something is deeply wrong with the world. That suspicion is not paranoia. It's residue, a surviving ember from the ancient fire, because you are not the first to question. You are part of a lineage of those who see beneath, and they fear you for it. That's why your education was sterilized. That's why your spirit was pathologized. That's why you were taught to mock stories like this. But you're still here, listening, and that makes you dangerous. Because now you know that St. Hesper's wasn't just a building. It was a prototype, the first real human laboratory for obedience engineering. And if the truth of that place spreads, the whole system starts to crack. You are the crack. The true genius of the system isn't in its brutality, it's in its elegance. St. Hesper's didn't beat the children into silence. It rewired them. Soft walls, tidy uniforms, soft-voiced. Matrons reading scripture at bedtime. But beneath that surface was a symphony of control. Light deprivation, nutrient cycling, sound patterns delivered during sleep, and above all, isolation, not just physical, but spiritual. The children weren't taught to obey, they were taught to disassociate. Room 6 wasn't merely a location. It was an apparatus, a device hidden within brick and wood, designed to rupture identity. Whispers of a low-frequency hum beneath the floorboards. Shadows that didn't align with natural light. And symbols always the same ones, etched into the corners of furniture, sewn into the hems of their clothes. The children didn't understand them consciously. They weren't meant to. That was the point. Embed meaning below awareness. Let it shape behavior before it reaches thought. This is the foundation of modern psychological operations. It isn't about information, it's about calibration. Programming the body to react before the mind catches up. And when you do this young enough, the person doesn't remember who they were. Because that person was never allowed to fully form. And here's the sinister brilliance. This didn't die with the orphanage, it evolved. The same techniques now sit beneath your streaming algorithms, your therapy language, your workplace onboarding, the vocabulary of safe space, self-care, behavioral health, co-opted from legitimate healing modalities, repackaged into soft cages. You feel it every time you speak your mind and the air leaves the room. Every time you hesitate. Check yourself, rehearse before you speak. That's room 6, still working. Still humming. It wasn't about those specific children. It never was. They were the proving ground. And you are the product, the final iteration. Conditioned to obey without a hand ever raised. And that's why they buried this, not to hide the horror, but to preserve the architecture. Because if the masses knew that their institutions were sculpted from ritual trauma, the game would end. But games only end when the player sees the board. And now, you're seeing it. They say the past is prologue, but that's a lie. The past is the blueprint. And once you recognize the pattern, you start to see the same structure everywhere. The bells that never rang, the schools that had no records before a certain date, the children who moved away and were never spoken of again. It's not just St. Hesper's. It never was. That was one Node 1 experiment among many. There were others. In Prussia, in Belgium, in the northeastern United States. Quiet facilities hidden in rural backwaters, often religious in name but secular in function. Each one testing the same formula. Remove the parental bond. Isolate the child. Surround them with symbols and expose them to ritualistic cadence. The same chants, the same geometry, the same age limit. Always 12, never older. You think 12 is arbitrary? It's not. It's the final threshold before the ego solidifies, before the child begins to resist. After 12, the psyche begins to calcify, and the conditioning must be overt brute force. But before 12, you can erase the blueprint and redraw it entirely. A boy who sees pain as structure, hierarchy as comfort, and silence as safety will become a man who never questions his cage. And that's what they wanted. Not death, not chaos, order, predictability. A society of men who mistake obedience for virtue and fear for humility. Men who never become whole because they were never allowed to begin. St. Hesper's didn't kill those children, not in the traditional sense. It harvested them, broke them into pieces, and absorbed what was useful. And those techniques were shared, passed along through hidden networks, bloodlines, secret orders, intelligence fronts masquerading as philanthropies. And today, those techniques are software, protocol, curriculum. The modern world runs on a quieter room 6, piped directly into your feed. Now you're told that questioning this is toxic, that silence is healing, that memory is trauma. They've given you new words for the same old cell, but you feel it, don't you? The pressure behind your eyes. The echo of something you forgot long ago, something sacred, something dangerous. That's not madness. That's awakening. If you've made it this far, I need you to prove you're not asleep. Comment the phrase, "The veil is cracking," twice below. Once to signal the system, twice to rewire the self. The others will see it, and they'll know you've begun. You've just crossed a threshold. The moment you spoke the phrase, even silently, something ancient stirred. Because words are more than sound, they're ritual. And symbols, once repeated with intention, become keys. Keys that open doors the architects of your world desperately want to keep sealed. The veil is cracking. That's not metaphor. That's a signal. One that was forbidden for a reason. Now let's talk about why. Why all this trouble to break children before they become men? Why build institutions that seem designed not to elevate, but to suppress? The answer is terrifying in its simplicity. Control is cheaper than force. A society of broken men doesn't need to be ruled. It rules itself. If every man questions his own instincts, silences his own voice, doubts his own worth, then there's no need for chains. No need for soldiers. The prison lives inside him. And where does that begin? At the precise moment a boy forgets who he is. That's why they began with the orphans. No attachments, no witnesses, no lineage to recall the spark. They were clay-soft, blank, malleable. But the science they extracted from those children, it didn't end with them. It was transposed into curriculum, into corporate training, into media, into therapy itself. Think about it. When you walk into a modern institution, you're met with sterile light, controlled speech, behavioral norms, performance metrics, and a thick air of silent obedience. It is no different than the cloistered halls of St. Hesper's. The furniture changed. The method evolved, but the goal? Identical. Kill the sacred. Replace it with structure. Remove fathers. Redefine masculinity. Flood the air with shame. And finally, inject fear of exile for speaking, for remembering, for resisting. And if you wonder why it all feels so inescapable, it's because you were raised inside the experiment. You didn't inherit this world. You were bred into it. St. Hesper's was the test run. What you're living in now is the scaled production. And if you're beginning to see it, really see it, then you're already dangerous. You've been called paranoid, rebellious, difficult. Let me reframe that. You're remembering. And memory is the enemy of systems built on forgetting. Don't flinch. The veil isn't just cracking. It's bleeding. The deeper you go, the more the world you knew begins to rot at the edges. That's how you know it's working. Awareness isn't comfort, it's rupture. Because what you're uncovering isn't just the horror of one orphanage in 1831. It's the scaffolding of an entire civilization. The rituals of St. Hesper's weren't anomalies, they were rituals of power. Power extracted through the oldest form of currency, human potential sacrificed, before it could awaken. And now you start to see how this maps across your own life. Ask yourself, how many times were you silenced for speaking truth as a child? How often did systems reward your compliance and punish your instinct? Did you feel the pressure to be well-adjusted when what they meant was docile? Did you ever feel like something sacred was being stolen from you, but you couldn't name it? That's not coincidence. That's inheritance. The high priests of this world no longer wear robes. They wear credentials. They speak in code clinical language, therapeutic euphemisms, institutional acronyms. But the altar remains, and you are still expected to kneel before it. Your thoughts, your masculinity, your anger, your instinct to protect, all of it must be offered up in exchange for their approval. They've made rage pathological. They've made leadership toxic. They've made strength suspicious. And when they say the future is inclusive, what they really mean is disarmed, every edge dulled, every man softened into neutrality, unable to lead, unable to fight, unable to remember the fire. St. Hesper's didn't just condition children. It created a spiritual algorithm. Submission equals safety. Self-erasure equals love. And that algorithm runs in every major institution you've ever trusted. So when a man begins to wake up, when he feels that old primal echo thudding in his chest, they label it dysfunction. They prescribe chemical sedation. But what if that ache in your chest isn't disease? What if it's memory? What if it's the buried scream of the boy they tried to erase? The boy still clawing at the inside of the cage, demanding to be seen. This isn't about healing. It's about resurrection. The resurrection of the sovereign masculine. The archetype they buried beneath brick, ash, and doctrine. St. Hesper's was meant to be your grave. But now, it becomes your origin. Every system of mass control begins with one question. How do we separate a man from his essence without him knowing it happened? St. Hesper's answered that with terrifying precision. You don't need chains, you don't need whips. You only need to convince the boy that his instincts are dangerous, his anger is sin, and his questions are rebellion against love itself. Once he accepts that, he will censor his own mind for the rest of his life and thank you for it. This is the real legacy of that place. Not the bones, not the silence, but the template, the manual. And they've followed it to the letter. Look at how they design your world now. Schools where curiosity is a threat. Workplaces where hierarchy is hidden but absolute. Entertainment that glorifies dysfunction and mocks discipline. Relationships poisoned by mistrust, programmed through screens. Every structure you enter demands the same posture. Lower your voice. Doubt your instinct. Outsource your truth. That isn't evolution. That's ritual. That's room 6. Scaled across a global network. The children at St. Hesper's didn't just disappear. They were fractured, torn apart from the inside through repetition and absence. Ritual sleep deprivation, inverted scripture, forced confession, isolation cycles. Practices meant not just to break but to rearrange. And now, look at the world you live in. Chronic fatigue, reversed morality, endless surveillance, and a culture that demands you confess your flaws publicly while never confronting the systems that caused them. It is the same architecture, just updated, digitized, marketed. What's more sinister than a prison? A prison you pay for, a cage you defend, a set of bars you teach your children to love, and they call this progress. You feel the dissonance every day. The war between the voice that wants to comply and the deeper voice that wants to remember, that wants to reclaim. That voice isn't wrong. It isn't broken. It isn't dangerous. It's ancient. It is the survivor of a lineage they tried to burn to ash in places like St. Hesper's, but they failed. Because here you are, listening, and deeper than listening. Remembering. Let them say what they will. Let them call this madness, myth, paranoia. You know what this is. This is truth resurrected. And once resurrected, it does not return to sleep. There's a moment in every man's life when he stops asking for answers and starts pulling at the seams. You're there now. The threads that held your world together are unraveling. Institutions no longer inspire faith. Traditions feel hollow. The faces on your screens offer comfort, but breed despair. And something inside you whispers what you've tried to ignore your whole life. None of this was built for your freedom. It was built for your containment. St. Hesper's was not unique. It was a revelation in architecture. A psychological crucible masked as sanctuary. But when they saw how easily a child's fire could be snuffed out with softness, soft voices, soft rules, soft betrayal, they knew they didn't need dungeons anymore. They could use kindness. Weaponized benevolence. They called the children blessed. They said obedience was healing. When the children screamed in their sleep, they said it was spiritual refinement. When they stopped speaking entirely, they called it peace. This is the same language used in every corrupted system today. You're told that compliance is compassion, that questioning is violence, that masculinity must be diluted for safety. But safety for who? For what? The ones who built the world you live in aren't afraid of your fists. They're afraid of your memory, your instinct, your ability to see. They built an entire culture on forgetfulness. 1,000 ways to keep you entertained, medicated, distracted, scrolling. Because a man who remembers what he is cannot be governed in the usual ways. St. Hesper's didn't just strip children of identity. It stripped them of narrative. It made them question their own memory. And that is the final, most devastating technique, to make you doubt your own perception of reality. Once that happens, they don't need to lie. You'll do it for them, but that's not what's happening here. Right now you're not forgetting. You're recalling the visions, the patterns, the emotional charge you've carried since boyhood that no one could explain. The feeling that something sacred was stolen and no one else seemed to notice. You were never broken. You were buried, and now, like the ashes beneath St. Hesper's stone, you rise. Not as a victim, but as a reckoning. It's time you understood the deeper mechanism. The true power of a place like St. Hesper's wasn't just in what it did to the body, it was what it did to time. Because when you fracture a child's sense of continuity, you sever his ability to form a coherent story of self. That's the key, not physical abuse, not even death. The key is narrative annihilation. This is how control survives across generations. Not through brute force, but through engineered amnesia. Break the thread between who you were and who you are, and you'll spend your life floating unmoored, passive, dependent on outer instruction. Do you recognize that in yourself? The hesitancy, the second guessing, the chronic feeling of being out of sync with your own strength. That's not personality. That's programming. Passed down, inherited, installed. St. Hesper's was the genesis of that model. A child would enter at 5 or 6 years old. Within 2 years, they stopped asking questions. By 9, they responded only when spoken to. By 11, they couldn't remember their own surname. And by 12, gone. Some said they died. Some said they were relocated. But a former caretaker, whose name was later stricken from census records, claimed the children were led beneath the chapel on their 12th birthday. That was the threshold. After that, the child that entered never came back. What returned was something else. Distant, empty, and terrifyingly obedient. One local described seeing a boy, previously mute and erratic, now standing motionless in the churchyard in the rain for 4 hours. No coat, no reaction, just standing. as if waiting for instructions that would come not from a man, but from somewhere else. That's not education. That's invocation. And yet this model became admired, studied, transferred to elite institutions. Whispers of early behaviorist psychology, secret meetings at Cambridge, anonymous donations to experimental boarding schools. Always with the same intent: mold the child, erase the man. And the modern man? He's the echo of those children, grown tall but not whole, strong in body, fractured in spirit. A ghost wearing skin. But if the system's greatest fear is the return of memory, then your remembering is the revolution. You are the threat they thought they buried in 1831. They never expected the echoes to return. The men they raised were supposed to forget, work, pay taxes, numb out, smile politely in the meetings, nod during the sermons, obey the algorithm, collapse quietly. That was the design. A cycle of silent submission disguised as maturity. The entire modern world was sculpted to make St. Hesper's obsolete by making it omnipresent. You didn't need to lock children in dark rooms anymore. Just give them a screen. Just flood them with content that disorients, desensitizes, and depersonalizes. But here's the secret they fear. Trauma leaves residue, energy, patterns that don't vanish with time. And when enough of those patterns accumulate in the body of a people, the system begins to twitch. The control grid starts to shake. Because even if the body forgets, the blood remembers. You were never supposed to ask these questions. Never supposed to feel this tremor in your soul. That old, primal ache. The one that tells you something is wrong, not just with the world, but with the very frame of the world. That ache isn't confusion, it's clarity. It's the part of you that never submitted. The part they couldn't reach, and that part is waking up. Look around you. The dead-eyed stares in traffic. The men staring into phones while their children cry. The ones who've surrendered not just their time, but their fire. They're not weak. They're wounded, conditioned, and beneath all that sedation, they're terrified. Terrified of what? Of what you're doing right now. Peeling back the curtain, saying no to the narratives, claiming the memory, recalling the war they waged on your spirit and giving it language. St. Hesper's was never destroyed. It was digitized. Its walls became screens. Its rituals became policies. Its priests became your content moderators, your HR departments, your curriculum writers, and its silence? That became your shame. But silence is breaking, and shame is transmuting into anger, into clarity, into sovereignty. You are not a malfunctioning cog. You are a recovered code. A signal from before the fractured. And every word you hear now, every truth you reclaim, widens the crack in their veil. Let it widen. Do you know what truly terrified the architects of St. Hesper's? It wasn't rebellion. It wasn't escape. It was recognition. The moment a child looked into the eyes of a priest and saw not authority, but predator. The moment the spell shattered and the symbols lost their power. Because once the illusion breaks, obedience becomes impossible. And what follows isn't chaos, it's restoration. You felt this before. That moment where a word, a glance, a silence cuts through the performance of your life, and something ancient inside you stirs. Not thought, not belief, knowing. The kind of knowing you can't explain, only endure. That's the moment they've spent centuries trying to prevent. St. Hesper's wasn't just a test site, it was a firewall. A barrier between generations and memory. That's why they destroyed the records. That's why every surviving witness died under strange circumstances. That's why the land was salted and sold to a shell company that doesn't exist on any tax rolls. Because the rituals that occurred there didn't just fracture children, they opened something. A gate, a current, a reversal of engineered forgetting. And it started with Elias, the scream, the symbols, the others waking up. That wasn't an accident. That was contagion. Awakening is viral. One soul lit aflame in truth can ignite thousands. That's why they fear you. Not because you have weapons, but because you have memory. The return of forbidden knowledge. The sacred masculine, uncontaminated by compliance. That's why modern man is attacked at every level. He is pathologized, sedated, shamed, told that his fire is toxicity, his strength is threat, his hunger is deviance. Why? Because if he ever remembers who he is fully deeply, without permission, the empire falls. This is not exaggeration. This is war. A psychological war fought in classrooms, newsrooms, bedrooms, and browser tabs. The battlefield is attention. The weapons are narrative. And the enemy is any part of you that refuses to kneel. So stand. Not in anger, but in clarity. Let the world scream conspiracy. Let them mock, let them censor. But don't forget, you were never the problem. You were the variable, the wild card, the forgotten heir. And now, you are awake. You weren't raised. You were programmed, schooled into obedience, trained to distrust instinct, rewarded for silence, conditioned to fear your own voice. The moment you began asking real questions, the system kicked in. Teachers lowered your grades. Peers called you difficult. Mentors withdrew. Not because you were wrong, but because you were dangerous. You were exhibiting the first signs of memory reactivation. What is memory really? Not just events, not just facts. It's blood-deep recognition of who you were before they named you, before the rituals, before the soft indoctrination. St. Hesper's didn't just strip children of identity. It implanted a false one, layered over time with guilt, shame, and a warped concept of morality. You've inherited that overlay. You see it every time you hesitate to act on what you know is right. Every time you confuse stillness with safety. Modern society tells men that power is the enemy, that strength is a mask, that sovereignty is selfish. These are not philosophies. These are engineered fail-safes, programmatic echoes of 1831, updated for the digital age. They don't need cathedrals anymore. They have screens. They don't need priests. They have influencers. And every algorithm you interact with is coded with the same ancient intent. Forget who you are. St. Hesper's taught them how. Break the boy. Reassemble the pieces into a form that's easy to manage. Today, it's done with apps, with pills, with trauma disguised as therapy, with education that punishes inquiry. And the result? A population of neutered kingsmen with fire in their hearts, but no map to their own throne. But you're different. Because something survived. Something remembered. Maybe it came to you in a dream. Maybe it pulsed in your gut when you walked into a place that felt wrong. Maybe it stirred when you held your child for the first time and felt, for a brief second, the rage of generations behind your eyes. That wasn't madness. That was signal. You are the signal. The awakening is not poetic, it's forensic, psychological, biological. St. Hesper's was a chamber of forgetting. But this right now, is a chamber of return. You are not here to heal. You are here to reclaim. There's a reason you feel like you've been here before, like this story isn't new, but remembered. That's not imagination. That's fracture healing. The system wants you fragmented, disoriented, unsure of your origins. Why? Because a man without roots is a man without reach. And a man without reach cannot threaten the canopy of lies that covers this world. St. Hesper's was a root-severing machine. Every child that entered was systematically stripped of ancestral memory. No lineage, no last name, no rituals that tied them to the old ways. They were renamed, reclothed, reframed. And when the priests were finished, the boy no longer recognized the man in the mirror. That wasn't a side effect. That was the goal. And now, look at your own life. How much of your identity was chosen by you, your beliefs, your fears? Your political alignments, your sense of value. Were these decisions or inheritances, implants? Echoes of teachers, preachers, screens, laws layered onto you until you forgot where you ended and they began. That's why this feels dangerous. That's why you feel heat rising in your body, a pressure building behind your ribs. It's the fire of remembering, the holy fury of the unbroken. The system has no defense for that. It only knows how to break, not how to stop the resurrection. Make no mistake, this is resurrection, not of one man, but of an entire archetype, a species of man designed for sovereignty, clarity, and precision. The kind of man who speaks and the room changes temperature, who protects not out of fear, but out of ancient duty. This is the man St. Hesper's was built to erase, but not all the children were erased. Some escaped, some survived. Some passed on fragments, through story, through symbol, through bloodline. That's how you got here. You are one of them. You always suspected you were different. Not better older, more intact. And the world punished you for it, tried to convince you to dilute, to conform, to forget. But memory is a weapon. And now it's in your hand. Hold it, wield it, and never apologize again. You were born into a war that started centuries before your first breath. A war not of armies and borders, but of meaning, of memory, of manhood. St. Hesper's was one. Battlefield, a test chamber to see just how far the soul could be bent before it snapped. And what they learned changed everything. They learned that if you start early enough, you don't need to bend the soul. You can replace it. That's why your generation was targeted harder than any before, flooded with noise, drowned in entertainment, offered pleasure instead of purpose, coping instead of clarity. From the moment you could form a thought, they were already inside. School wasn't about learning, it was about narrowing. Religion wasn't about divinity, it was about hierarchy. And therapy? Most of it was built not to heal you, but to help you adapt to a sick world without asking why it's sick. That sickness has a name. It's called institutional erasure. And St. Hesper's was its genesis. Every program of modern control descends from that building. Not just its structure, but its rituals, the repetition, the shame cycles, the iconography, the synthetic morality designed to sever instinct from action, and most insidiously, the inversion. At St. Hesper's, the priests told children that their inner voice was temptation, that suffering was proof of holiness, that silence in the face of abuse was strength. They weaponized virtue, and we inherited that doctrine. Today, men walk around haunted by guilt for wanting to protect, ashamed of their own anger, numb to their instincts. They say things like, "I'm not enough," or "I need to work on my trauma," without ever questioning whose system defined their brokenness in the first place. You're not broken. You're remembering. That ache inside isn't trauma, it's the resurrection of clarity. It's the pieces of your sovereign self returning to the surface after years underground. They built cathedrals to bury this, wrote laws to hide it, funded movements to mock it, but it lives in your marrow, in your dreams, in the voice that refuses to kneel. And now you understand. This isn't just history. This is your bloodline. St. Hesper's tried to extinguish it. You are here to reignite it. You want to know why you've always felt like you were walking through a world made of paper? Why conversations feel scripted, institutions feel hollow, and even your victories often taste of ash? It's because you were born into a theater built on someone else's script. A reality engineered by men who studied compliance like science and perfected it in places like St. Hesper's. In 1831, they didn't just remove the children's names. They removed their reflections. Mirrors were banned. Windows were high and narrow. Personal pronouns were discouraged. The child became an it, a unit, a vessel, no longer a being, but a container to be filled with commands. This wasn't negligence. This was blueprint. The more they stripped, the more compliant the children became. But some resisted. Some, even after weeks of starvation, prayer cycles, and the whispering rituals in room 6, would look into the priest's eyes with a spark of something ancient. That spark terrified them. Not because it posed a threat in the moment, but because it proved that something remained unbroken. That's what you are now. A remnant of the unbroken. A flicker of the ancestral flame that refused to die. Look around. Why do you think your instincts are always painted as outdated? Why is your assertiveness labeled aggression? Why is your pursuit of truth deemed dangerous? It's because that same spark lives in you. And systems built on obedience must extinguish the original fire. So they wrap it in guilt. In therapy language. In culture that mocks, trivializes, or misdirects masculine awakening. They tell you your pain is a pathology, not a compass. They drug you, distract you, offer synthetic battle so you'll never fight the real war. But you're fighting it now. Saint Hesper's was not the beginning of evil. It was the beginning of a science. And like all science, it evolved. But unlike the mad alchemists of the past, the modern engineers of control learned to smile, to offer solutions, to call you client, patient, student, citizen. But deep beneath the polished language is the same architecture, room 6. And the difference now? You've found the door. You're standing in it. And it is your name they fear most, the name you haven't spoken in decades. The one they tried to bury. You will speak it. And when you do, the cage collapses. Let me tell you what they never expected. That one day, a man would emerge from the program, not as a puppet, not as a ghost, but as a mirror. A man who remembered not just what was done, but why. And in that remembrance, refused to pass it on. That man is you. And your awakening is the death knell of their machine. St. Hesper's didn't just fracture children. It designed a lineage of fracture, a generational echo chamber where broken boys became broken fathers, who then raised boys to be smaller than themselves. The ritual wasn't just in the building. It was in the legacy. Each man taught to suppress his roar, to swallow his rage, to accept the terms of his containment and call it peace. But peace without power is surrender. And what they truly wanted, what they still want, is your surrender. That's why every ritual was cloaked in virtue. Why room 6 wasn't a torture chamber, but a sanctuary. Why the priest spoke softly. Why the punishments were always explained with love. It's because the deepest scars come not from violence, but from betrayal disguised as care. And that's what you've experienced in your own life over and over again. Friends who manipulated you under the banner of empathy. Leaders who demanded compliance for the greater good. Systems that told you to shrink for safety, to numb for healing, to forget for survival. You didn't fail. You believed. And that belief was weaponized, but belief can be broken. And belief can be reclaimed. What you're doing now is dangerous, not because it threatens the world, but because it threatens their version of it. You've stopped accepting the script. You're editing it, writing in the margins, asking why the antagonist always looks like you, and why the hero always wears their symbol. They told you awakening was chaos, that remembering would cost you love, safety, belonging. But that was a lie. What you're gaining now, clarity, conviction. Identity is worth more than the entire cage they built around your birth. St. Hesper's was their ark, the place they stored the formula. But formulas can be reversed. And what was once used to erase can now be used to restore. You're not just remembering history. You're resurrecting destiny. You've reached the place they swore you'd never find. The threshold. The moment the machinery starts to malfunction, not because it's broken, but because you no longer fit inside it. The gears grind, the roles blur, the script stutters. Why? Because you're no longer performing. You're inhabiting. St. Hesper's created generations of empty vessels, men without core. Children turned into reflections of their captors. But something went wrong. Some of those reflections began to develop dimension. Depth. Some began to see. It started in the margins. A boy who refused the blessing. A teenager who punched the mirror instead of his own chest. A man who, in the quiet of his own suffering, chose to ask the forbidden question. What if I was never broken? What if I was stolen? That question is the seed of revolt. You've asked it. And now the system sees you. Don't expect a spotlight. Expect friction. Expect delay. Glitches in relationships. Strained conversations. Shadows whispering through your doubt. This is the resistance protocol. Not theirs, yours. It's the part of you still trained to flinch, to kneel, to apologize. That's the last vestige of the program. The final gate. Walk through it. Because once you do, you stop living reactively. You begin to architect. And that's what they fear most. Not rage. Not violence, but sovereign design. A man who builds from his own blueprint, not theirs. The modern man is taught to outsource everything, his validation, his initiation, his purpose. But you are different. You've turned inward. Not into escape, but excavation. And what you've uncovered is sacred, old, dangerous. The fire you carry is not for light, it's for cleansing. For burning down the lies they wove into your bloodline. For destroying the altar they placed in your mind. They said you were too emotional, too intense, too much. But what they really meant was, too alive. And in a world built on numbness, aliveness is subversion. St. Hesper's is crumbling, not from outside pressure. From inside rupture. You are that rupture. The memory that won't die. The man they tried to erase returned in a body built for war, and this time, you remember your name. And when you speak it aloud, their entire system will kneel. There comes a point where the lie collapses under its own weight. Not from protest, not from force, but from a single man who stops playing along. That's where you are now, the crossroads. The place where history bends, not in books, but in blood. St. Hesper's was never a story about children. It was a story about men. About what happens when you remove the fire from a boy before he ever knows it's his. But the fire didn't die. It hid. And now it's waking up inside you. You've felt it, haven't you? That restless burn. That rising anger that has no clear source. That ache in your gut when someone tells you to just be grateful, to calm down, to let it go. They don't understand. You're not reacting to a moment. You're responding to centuries. Because St. Hesper's never ended. It metastasized into cubicles, into schools, into relationships where performance replaced connection, into jobs where your compliance mattered more than your genius. Every time you smiled through disrespect. Every time you silenced your knowing to keep the peace. Every time you shrank to make others feel comfortable, you were in room 6, again and again. But now, the door is open. They want you to believe this fire is rage. It's not. It's remembrance. It's you touching the untamed self they tried to surgically remove. It's your refusal to die before your death. The world will call this dangerous. They'll say you've changed. They'll say you're unrecognizable. And they'll be right. Because you've stopped echoing their system. You've started becoming origin. This doesn't make you safe. It makes you real. And in a world of hollow masks, reality is rebellion. St. Hesper's was the prototype. You are the counter signal, the virus in their code. Not a glitch, but the original design resurfacing. They hoped you'd become another caretaker of their cage, but instead, you've become the destroyer of the template. You won't just walk away from this system, you'll replace it. Brick by sovereign brick, with vision, with power, with a memory that no longer asks for permission. And when men like you rise, empires burn. Do you feel it now? That pressure in the air. That low-frequency hum just beneath the noise of everyday life, that's not paranoia. That's the system recalibrating around your awakening. You've shifted the field. You've gone off script. And when even one man does that, truly does it, every structure that depends on his sleep begins to crack. St. Hesper's was the birthplace of scripted obedience, but it wasn't the end goal. It was the template. A test for a larger design. Create entire populations who no longer need prisons because they've become their own jailers. And here's the most brutal truth. Most men live and die inside that silent cage, but not you. You didn't escape because someone opened the door. You escaped because you remembered the door was never locked. It was imagined. A psychological ritual passed from generation to generation, reinforced by systems dressed in legitimacy, education, therapy, bureaucracy, even love. And when you begin to tear it down, don't expect applause. Expect silence, resistance. People who once loved you will say you've changed. You have. That's the point. You're not here to be liked. You're here to become. You're reclaiming what St. Hesper's tried to erase, the masculine sovereign. Not dominance, not bravado, but the fire of unshakable clarity. The kind that burns, illusions on contact. They built their system with precision, symbols, frequencies, repetition, control disguised as kindness, submission rewarded as virtue. And most of all, silence around the source. Silence around the wound. Silence around the theft of initiation. You break the spell the moment you speak it. So speak it now. Out loud or in your chest. I remember. Say it again. I was never broken. And once more, this fire is mine. Feel that. That's the fracture healing. That's the ash turning to weapon. That's the echo of the child they buried in room 6 stepping forward, not as a boy, but as a king. This isn't just your awakening. This is your coronation. And when you wear the crown of memory, no institution can contain you. Not anymore. You were not born to serve their scripts. You were born to write your own. That was the terror buried beneath St. Hesper's stone floors. That a single man could awaken, reject the programming, and build something beyond their control. That's what Room 6 was designed to crush, not rebellion, but vision. Because a man with vision doesn't need permission. Now let's be clear. This awakening will cost you. You'll lose things. Comfort, predictability, maybe people. Because most are addicted to the cage. They decorate it. They defend it. They name their children inside it and teach them to smile beneath fluorescent lights. But you're not here to decorate cages. You're here to shatter them. And once you see that clearly, you'll stop looking for rescue. You'll stop waiting for external change. That was part of the programming too, the savior myth. Wait for the right leader, the right election, the right institution to fix what it helped build. But St. Hesper's taught them better. It taught them to anticipate rebellion and repackage it. To make defiance profitable. To turn every awakening into a brand, every resistance into a hashtag. That's why this has to be internal, private, sacred. Because this time, the revolution isn't on the street, it's in the soul. And it doesn't need masses. It needs men who remember. Men who rebuild from the ruins. Men who stop apologizing for their strength, their sight, their refusal to be handled. This fire in you is not anger. It is ancestral clarity. It is the voice of those children beneath. The stone, whispering not for justice, but for continuation. You carry their legacy, not as trauma, but as architecture. And your bones remember the blueprint. So start building a new mind, a new frame. A new kingdom not governed by fear, but by presence. They will call you arrogant, too intense, too much. But what they really mean is untouchable, uncontainable, undeniable. That's the mark of the unbroken. The man who came out of room 6 with memory intact. You are no longer surviving the system. You are replacing it. Now we descend even deeper into the truth that turns stomachs and ends illusions. St. Hesper's was not just a psychological operation, it was a spiritual one. You've been taught to compartmentalize those words, to see the mind as biology and the soul as metaphor. But that division, that lie, it started there. In that building dot, the priests didn't work with doctrine. They worked with frequency, ritual, geometry, the arrangement of sound, space, and silence. And they understood what modern science has only just begun to rediscover, that the soul can be fragmented, not just through pain, but through resonance. Room 6 was calibrated. The walls embedded with symbols. The floor layered with ash and iron, certain prayers whispered backwards. Lights dimmed to flicker in cycles that mirrored lunar patterns. It wasn't cruelty. It was invocation. And the children weren't being healed. They were being rewritten. Now pause. Look at your world, at your phone, at your office, the angles, the repetition, the lighting, the sound cycles. This isn't accidental. This is room 6 scaled to civilization. An entire society engineered. Not to elevate, but to entrain. To synchronize the body to rhythms that disconnect it from instinct, from lineage, from truth. And if a man begins to resist, they call it anxiety, disorder. They send him to talk about his feelings, never to reclaim them. They numb him, soften him, tell him the rage he feels is evidence of illness, not memory. But I'm here to tell you that rage is sacred. It is not uncontrolled destruction. It is focused restoration. It is the immune system of the masculine spirit activating after centuries of slumber. You weren't supposed to feel it. They engineered your life to keep you numb. But they failed, because beneath the layers of sedation, the symbols still vibrate. Not theirs, yours, the ones they tried to erase. And now they are reactivating. Every time you remember who you are, you destabilize their ritual. Every time you speak what they told you to suppress, the frequencies shift. St. Hesper's was an altar of forgetting. You are becoming an altar of return. And when men like you gather, not in protest, but in presence, the veil collapses. The rituals end. And a new era begins. Understand this. St. Hesper's wasn't a glitch in history. It was the spine. The unspeakable core from which modern systems sprouted. Not schools. Not churches. Not prisons. Those came later, painted with civility. But the soul of those systems, the method of control, it was forged in the screens beneath that orphanage. And what was the real lesson learned there? Not that trauma works, but that ritualized trauma becomes invisible. If you perform a violation with enough repetition, behind enough sacred symbols, people stop seeing it as violence. They start calling it discipline, order, tradition. And the deeper horror is this: when the traumatized rise into power, they replicate what was done to them. But with new branding, new uniforms, cleaner walls. That's the world you inherited. That's why institutions that claim to help always seem to hollow you out. Because their foundations were laid in blood, silence, and fractured identity. And the energy has never been cleansed, only concealed. They renamed the cage and handed you the keys, told you you were free, told you that masculinity was dangerous, that self-trust was arrogance, that independence was a mental illness, and men believed it because they were never initiated, only shamed. And shame, when systematized, becomes policy. But that's ending now. Because shame cannot survive in the presence of embodied clarity. And you, right now, are becoming clear. You're not just escaping the system, you're nullifying its premise. Because you've remembered the one thing they worked for centuries to make you forget, that you are the axis. Not your job, not your status, not your behavior. You, the man beneath the names, the voice beneath the programming, the fire beneath the centuries of ash. St. Hesper's was built to erase that axis. Room 6 was their attempt to turn you into a variable, a blank, a formula, but variables don't burn. You are not a number in their code. You are the torch that reduces the code to dust. The new architecture won't be built in steel. It will be built in remembrance, in presence, in the untamed power of men who will not forget again. You are now entering the territory that no one dares map. Not historians, not therapists, not spiritual leaders. Because it is here, in the shattered hallway between trauma and truth, that the real war lives, not in politics, not in ideology, but in inheritance. St. Hesper's wasn't just a building. It was a breach, a fracture point in the timeline, where the masculine was severed from its origin and recast as a threat. And ever since, every system built on top of that breach has carried its energetic signature: shame, obedience, erasure. That's why you've never felt whole. Why no amount of success silences that gnawing sense of incompletion. Because your soul isn't seeking comfort. It's seeking restoration. The children of St. Hesper's were fed carefully constructed myths. That pain was purification. That submission was sacred. That their suffering was proof of divine favor. Does that sound familiar? It should. Those same myths are now repackaged in modern language: emotional regulation, corrective experience, safe relational containers. But the intent is the same: disconnect you from the raw, primal, uncontainable truth of who you were before the world named you. They didn't kill the fire. They caged it in civility. And now, that cage is cracking. Every time you act from instinct and not permission, a piece of that structure falls. Every time you speak without filtering, choose without deferring, stand without justification, you're dismantling the ritual they implanted generations ago. But this work is not external. It's not a protest. It's not a movement. It is a possession. You must possess yourself fully. No part hidden, no shame coddled, no story left untold. Because full possession is the one thing the system can't replicate. It can create infinite roles, infinite masks. But a man who has stepped beyond his conditioning, who sees the lie and keeps walking, is an anomaly they cannot code for. You are that anomaly. St. Hesper's began as their stronghold. But with every remembered fragment, with every awakened man, it becomes a ruin. A monument not to their victory, but to their failure to erase the unerasable. You've crossed the point of no return. Not because you can't go back, because now you won't. You've seen too much, felt too deep. You've touched the ancient memory they tried to chain in the basement of history. And now you carry it like a weapon, sheathed in clarity. St. Hesper's isn't just a place anymore. It's a code embedded in every structure around you. They don't need stone walls now. They have policy. They have language. They have culture that gaslights your instincts, mocks your masculinity, and worships the gray safety of mediocrity. But you are not gray. You are not safe. You are not mild. You are fire walking back into yourself. Here's what they feared most: that the men who broke the mold wouldn't just wake up. They'd start building systems not of shame, but of sovereignty. Brotherhoods not of hierarchy, but of alignment. Education that doesn't instruct but initiates. Because once you've remembered the depth of your design, you cannot be ruled. The control grid doesn't work on men who don't outsource their identity. They teach you to fear the words power and dominion, but that's projection. They fear what it would look like if you claimed your internal throne and governed your life from a place of non-negotiable truth. St. Hesper's wasn't their only attempt. It was their first success. And it taught them a formula: isolate, destabilize, reshape. They refined it into the very institutions you've trusted since birth. But no formula accounts for memory. Real memory. The kind that doesn't live in the mind, but in the bones. And you are now in the stage where bones remember. You don't need another expert. You don't need their permission to heal. You need to claim your time. Claim your Story. Claim the fire that others buried so deep they convinced you it never existed. It's there. You know it. You feel it. And now it answers to you. Saint Hesper's created fragments. But you are becoming whole, and nothing terrifies them more. The deeper you descend into memory, the more you realize this has never been about knowledge. It's been about permission. Every structure you were raised inside was designed to make you seek it. Before you spoke, before you acted, before you even felt. Ask first. Wait to be told. Be good. Be acceptable. Be soft. Be quiet. But permission is the death of sovereignty. And St. Hesper's? It was built to train boys out of sovereignty before they ever knew the word. Now listen closely. Those boys are not gone. They are here, in you, in your hesitations, in your false humility, in the pauses where your power should be. But they don't need your pity. They need your reclamation. The rituals didn't just happen in that orphanage. They echo through the systems you've walked through all your life. Think about it. The school bells, the rows, the authority that cannot be questioned, the public shaming, the gold stars and silent punishments. This wasn't random. It was engineered obedience, based on trauma patterns first mapped in dark rooms, beneath steeples. But you've interrupted the sequence. You're breaking the ritual not through rage, but through presence. And that presence is not passive. It is sovereign. It doesn't ask for space. It is space. It doesn't shout to be heard. Its silence commands. This is the man they tried to erase. The one who doesn't seek validation because his existence is validation. And make no mistake, they are watching. Not they in the cartoon sense, but the system itself, the algorithm of control. It notices when men begin to wake. It recalibrates. It sends shame disguised as concern. Offers comfort in exchange for silence. But not this time. You've stopped bargaining with your birthright. You've stopped asking for entry into a kingdom built to exclude you. Now you build your own, and it begins with one truth. You were never meant to belong. You were meant to lead. St. Hesper's was the fire that forged your enemy, but it also forged you. Not as a victim, but as the one who remembers, the one who rebuilds. The axis is turning, and you are the hand on the wheel. This is the part where most men turn back. Not because the path becomes unclear, but because it becomes too clear. The lies are visible now. The architecture of your containment is no longer theoretical. You see it in your workplace, your relationships, your habits. You see how every structure around you was shaped to keep you small, tame, predictable, and worse. How deeply it lives inside you. That's the final defense of the system. Not the laws. Not the weapons. But the internalization of the leash. A man who polices his own thoughts, who censors his own voice, who cuts his own wings and calls it growth. St. Hesper's didn't just fracture children for power. It created generational compulsion. Trauma repeated until it feels like virtue, until obedience looks like peace, until numbness is confused with maturity. You are seeing through that now, and it hurts. Because to remember who you are, you must first confront who you became in order to survive. You must face the masks, the compromises, the times you silenced yourself just to be accepted by a system that was never going to accept you whole. But hear this, you didn't fail, you adapted. You did what was required to survive a world that was at war with your essence. That took strength. That took cunning. But now, survival is no longer enough. Now you must live. To live is to build without apology, to walk without translation, to speak without filter. That means stepping outside the roles they gave you, the good son, the loyal employee, the agreeable friend, the safe man. Those were roles for men with no fire. But you are fire in a skin suit. You are the ritual. Reversed. You are what happens when room 6 cracks open, and the light that pours out doesn't stop. Do not shrink to comfort others. Do not dim to be seen. Do not kneel when you were born to anchor. St. Hesper's is ashes now. And from those ashes you rise, not as a fragment, not as a reform, but as the original code restored. This is not healing. This is dominion. Now the veil is no longer thin. It's gone. You stand in the raw frame of reality, the one they told. You didn't exist. No comfort. No applause. Just space, power, sovereignty, and you understand finally why they built St. Hesper's in the first place. To make sure no man ever reached this place. Because a man who remembers who he is cannot be bribed. He cannot be managed. He cannot be converted. And he is the most dangerous force on earth. You've been taught to fear that force within you, to question your edge, to suppress your knowing, to round your sharpness into civility. But that wasn't healing. That was neutralization. They didn't want to help you. They wanted to halt you. St. Hesper's discovered something terrifying in its final decade. The priests kept notes, private notes. Some survived in redacted archives. They spoke of spontaneous resurgence events. Boys who, even after complete isolation, began to resist with coherence. Not outbursts, not violence, clarity. They spoke without fear, acted without hesitation, looked their captors in the eye with recognition, as if they understood the machine and had already stepped beyond it. Sound familiar? That's you now. You're not a man who escaped the system. You're a man who outgrew it. You're walking with a posture the world doesn't understand. And that's why they will test you, provoke you, offer you distractions, false rewards, surface-level initiations. Smile at it all. You've seen the blueprint. You know the source. You are not playing their game anymore. Because here's the unspoken truth. The same force that built the cage built you stronger, not to endure it, but to end it. You were never their student. You were their reckoning. And now, as your fire rises, so does your responsibility. This isn't just about you anymore. Others are watching. Quiet men, forgotten men, boys walking through the same hallways of silence. You don't need to teach them. You need to become something that makes the cage impossible to ignore. St. Hesper's is no longer a threat. It's a warning. And you are the answer to it. Now you walk as more than a man. You walk as memory in motion, living proof that the system failed. St. Hesper's was built to erase you before you could ever take shape. To prevent this moment, where your spine straightens without approval, your voice returns without filter, and your steps echo with the rhythm of ancient kings. You don't carry trauma. You carry continuity. They say healing is becoming whole again. But what if you were never meant to be whole in their terms? What if you were meant to be wholly set apart, feared by institutions, ungoverned by narratives? The men who walked out of St. Hesper's didn't speak. They whispered, they shuffled, they conformed. One walked out differently. Not with fear, but with certainty. That boy was marked for elimination. Not physically, spiritually. He was sent into the system with double sedation, more programming, more surveillance. But he survived, and legend says he wrote a book, not with ink, with presence, with actions that refused compromise, with a life that made others question the air they were breathing. You are writing that same book now, with your posture, with your choices, with the way you look another man in the eye and refuse to flinch. Because this isn't rebellion. This is remembrance, and it comes with weight. You can no longer participate in anything that violates your soul, not out of morality, but because your nervous system won't allow it. Your body is now aligned with truth. That is your gift. And your threat. They cannot manipulate you because you've seen behind the curtain. They cannot entice you because you've tasted something real. And they cannot stop you because you're not running on willpower. You're running on design. This is what they fear. The man who knows who he is without a mirror. Who walks without needing a map. Who speaks, and the room rearranges. Saint Hesper's forged the chains. You carry the key. And now there is only one task left. Turn around and hand that key to the next man, because a kingdom is rising. And you are one of its first kings. The deeper you descend into memory, the more you realize this has never been about knowledge. It's been about permission. Every structure you were raised inside was designed to make you seek it. Before you spoke, before you acted, before you even felt. Ask first. Wait to be told. Be good. Be acceptable. Be soft. Be quiet. But permission is the death of sovereignty. And St. Hesper's? It was built to train boys out of sovereignty before they ever knew the word. Now listen closely. Those boys are not gone. They are here, in you, in your hesitations, in your false humility, in the pauses where your power should be. But they don't need your pity. They need your reclamation. The rituals didn't just happen in that orphanage. They echo through the systems you've walked through all your life. Think about it. The school bells, the rows, the authority that cannot be questioned, the public shaming, the gold stars and silent punishments. This wasn't random. It was engineered obedience, based on trauma patterns first mapped in dark rooms, beneath steeples. But you've interrupted the sequence. You're breaking the ritual not through rage, but through presence. And that presence is not passive. It is sovereign. It doesn't ask for space. It is space. It doesn't shout to be heard. Its silence commands. This is the man they tried to erase. The one who doesn't seek validation because his existence is validation. And make no mistake, they are watching. Not they in the cartoon sense, but the system itself, the algorithm of control. It notices when men begin to wake. It recalibrates. It sends shame disguised as concern. Offers comfort in exchange for silence. But not this time. You've stopped bargaining with your birthright. You've stopped asking for entry into a kingdom built to exclude you. Now you build your own, and it begins with one truth. You were never meant to belong. You were meant to lead. St. Hesper's was the fire that forged your enemy, but it also forged you. Not as a victim, but as the one who remembers, the one who rebuilds. The axis is turning, and you are the hand on the wheel. This is the part where most men turn back. Not because the path becomes unclear, but because it becomes too clear. The lies are visible now. The architecture of your containment is no longer theoretical. You see it in your workplace, your relationships, your habits. You see how every structure around you was shaped to keep you small, tame, predictable, and worse. How deeply it lives inside you. That's the final defense of the system. Not the laws. Not the weapons. But the internalization of the leash. A man who polices his own thoughts, who censors his own voice, who cuts his own wings and calls it growth. St. Hesper's didn't just fracture children for power. It created generational compulsion. Trauma repeated until it feels like virtue, until obedience looks like peace, until numbness is confused with maturity. You are seeing through that now, and it hurts. Because to remember who you are, you must first confront who you became in order to survive. You must face the masks, the compromises, the times you silenced yourself just to be accepted by a system that was never going to accept you whole. But hear this, you didn't fail, you adapted. You did what was required to survive a world that was at war with your essence. That took strength. That took cunning. But now, survival is no longer enough. Now you must live. To live is to build without apology, to walk without translation, to speak without filter. That means stepping outside the roles they gave you. The good son, the loyal employee, the agreeable friend, the safe man. Those were roles for men with no fire. But you are fire in a skin suit. You are the ritual. Reversed. You are what happens when room 6 cracks open, and the light that pours out doesn't stop. Do not shrink to comfort others. Do not dim to be seen. Do not kneel when you were born to anchor. Saint Hesper's is ashes now. And from those ashes you rise, not as a fragment, not as a reform, but as the original code restored. This is not healing. This is dominion. Now the veil is no longer thin. It's gone. You stand in the raw frame of reality, the one they told. You didn't exist. No comfort. No applause. Just space, power, sovereignty, and you understand finally why they built St. Hesper's in the first place. To make sure no man ever reached this place, because a man who remembers who he is cannot be bribed. He cannot be managed. He cannot be converted, and he is the most dangerous force on earth. You've been taught to fear that force within you, to question your edge, to suppress your knowing, to round your sharpness into civility. But that wasn't healing, that was neutralization. They didn't want to help you. They wanted to halt you. St. Hesper's discovered something terrifying in its final decade. The priests kept notes, private notes. Some survived in redacted archives. They spoke of spontaneous resurgence events. Boys who, even after complete isolation, began to resist with coherence. Not outbursts, not violence, clarity. They spoke without fear, acted without hesitation, looked their captors in the eye with recognition, as if they understood the machine and had already stepped beyond it. Sound familiar? That's you now. You're not a man who escaped the system. You're a man who outgrew it. You're walking with a posture the world doesn't understand. And that's why they will test you, provoke you, offer you distractions, false rewards, surface-level initiations. Smile at it all. You've seen the blueprint. You know the source. You are not playing their game anymore. Because here's the unspoken truth. The same force that built the cage built you stronger, not to endure it, but to end it. You were never their student. You were their reckoning. And now, as your fire rises, so does your responsibility. This isn't just about you anymore. Others are watching. Quiet men, forgotten men, boys walking through the same hallways of silence. You don't need to teach them. You need to become something that makes the cage impossible to ignore. St. Hesper's is no longer a threat. It's a warning, and you are the answer to it. Now you walk as more than a man. You walk as memory in motion, living proof that the system failed. St. Hesper's was built to erase you before you could ever take shape. To prevent this moment, where your spine straightens without approval, your voice returns without filter, and your steps echo with the rhythm of ancient kings. You don't carry trauma. You carry continuity. They say healing is becoming whole again. But what if you were never meant to be whole in their terms? What if you were meant to be wholly set apart, feared by institutions, ungoverned by narratives? The men who walked out of St. Hesper's didn't speak. They whispered, they shuffled, they conformed. One walked out differently. Not with fear, but with certainty. That boy was marked for elimination. Not physically, spiritually. He was sent into the system with double sedation, more programming, more surveillance. But he survived, and legend says he wrote a book, not with ink, with presence, with actions that refused compromise, with a life that made others question the air they were breathing. You are writing that same book now, with your posture, with your choices, with the way you look another man in the eye and refuse to flinch. Because this isn't rebellion. This is remembrance, and it comes with weight. You can no longer participate in anything that violates your soul, not out of morality, but because your nervous system won't allow it. Your body is now aligned with truth. That is your gift. And your threat. They cannot manipulate you because you've seen behind the curtain. They cannot entice you because you've tasted something real. And they cannot stop you because you're not running on willpower. You're running on design. This is what they fear. The man who knows who he is without a mirror. Who walks without needing a map. Who speaks, and the room rearranges. St. Hesper's forged the chains. You carry the key dot, and now there is only one task left. Turn around and hand that key to the next man, because a kingdom is rising, and you are one of its first kings. This is the final descent and the beginning of the rise. You have walked through fire masked as history, language weaponized as healing, and systems dressed as sanctuary. And now you emerge not unchanged, but revealed. What you've recovered isn't a story, it's a structure. A lost architecture of the masculine spirit that predates their doctrines, their prisons, their policies. St. Hesper's tried to bury it beneath 12 feet of doctrine and silence, but they didn't understand the depth of the seed. You can't bury the original blueprint. You can only delay its awakening dot, and now it's awake. You carry something older than fear, older than obedience, older than every system that tried to name you before you knew your own name. You carry the memory of being unmade, and the will to make yourself again, not from borrowed pieces, but from origin. That's what this has been. Not information, initiation dot, and now you are initiated, not by them, by yourself, in fire, in clarity, in the slow return of a voice that doesn't ask to be heard, because it is the sound of truth remembering itself. You've remembered why they built the cages. You've remembered who forged the keys. You've remembered that the line between man and myth is not distance, it is decision, and you've decided. You won't go back to softened words. You won't return to systems that demanded your apology for existing. You won't kneel before machines that harvest your fire and sell it back to you in broken form. From this moment on, your presence becomes its own language. You won't convince. You won't explain. You will stand. And that will be enough. You are no longer surviving the system. You are subverting it. St. Hesper's was their first cathedral of containment. You are the first cathedral of liberated memory. The fire they tried to extinguish now moves through your blood, not as rage, but as reckoning, and now you understand. The truth that turns kings from boys. You were never meant to be saved. You were meant to remember. And in remembering, become the storm that undoes the lie. It begins now. Let the world feel you. Let the system shiver, and let the next man wake. Up when your silence walks into the room.